this happened in the late 1990s. I heard the story from a friend of mine named Elena. Back then, she was a young, unmarried nurse who had spent several years serving under contract in Chechnya. At that time, military contractors were still getting relatively good money. After a few deployments, Elena managed to buy herself a small room in a communal apartment in a regional city somewhere in the Urals. For a girl from a remote village, that was a huge step forward. It meant escaping a place where beauty and youth slowly faded among chronic alcoholism and the hopeless atmosphere of a dying workers' settlement on the outskirts of the Sverdlovsk region. But to be fair, not everyone in those fading Ural villages is a drunk. There are also hard-working, honest men there, the kind who loved their homeland deeply and have no intention of ever leaving. One of those guys was Sasha. According to Elena, he had been hopelessly in love with her since elementary school. But whether it was his natural shyness or the sheer depths of his feelings, he never dared to make a move. Not once did he even ask her out on a date. Only years later, when Elena was already 25 and occasionally came home from the city to visit her parents, Sasha finally gathered the courage to invite her on a boat trip along the remote rivers of the Urals. Those places are already isolated by land, but by river you can reach areas that feel completely cut off from civilization. For people who love exploring, it's an incredible place. Along the riverbanks, you can find abandoned villages, half-collapsed churches, and even water mills that date back to the century before last. And best of all, no crowds of tourists screaming and littering everywhere. Just wild nature, silence, clean air. Perfect. So early one morning, Lena and Sasha set off on that river trip. She wasn't married. He wasn't either. It seemed like the perfect chance to finally get closer. But according to Lena, Sasha turned out to be a man made of stone. During the entire 2-day trip, he never once tried to touch her. Never hinted at his feelings, though you could clearly see them in his eyes. And she was a beautiful girl. That evening, they stopped near the high bank of an abandoned village that had been deserted for decades. Sasha knew the area well. He hunted and fished there often. They found one of the old houses that was still standing and decided to spend the night inside. Before going to sleep, lying in opposite corners of the room, Sasha told her a strange story that had happened to him recently. And that story is what I want to tell you now. Sasha usually went hunting or fishing alone. His childhood friends had either moved to the city or drunk themselves into oblivion. But he loved those places. Whenever he had a free day, he'd grab his rifle, jump into his motorboat, and disappear into the rivers, looking for new, unexplored spots. One day he traveled so far into the wilderness that several times he had to drag his boat across shallow sandbanks by hand. At some points the river had nearly dried up into a narrow stream. Eventually though, the river opened up into a wide stretch of water, so wide it almost felt like the sea. Sasha was amazed. He had never seen that place before. After a few kilometers, he noticed the remains of an abandoned village on the shore. Only 5 or 6 houses were still standing above the tall grass. It was getting late, so he pulled the boat ashore and went to take a look. Most of the houses were falling apart, but one small building on the edge of the settlement was still in decent condition. Behind it began a thick forest. The roof was intact. That was good enough. By the time he finished dealing with the boat and finding the house, it was already dark. Sasha settled into the only large room inside. He ate a quick meal and lay down on an old wooden bench that was still sturdy enough to sleep on. For a city person, spending the night alone in an abandoned forest village might sound like a scene from a horror movie. For a hunter, it's just another night in the woods. On the table in the center of the room, there was even a thick wax candle someone had left behind. Apparently, Sasha wasn't the first traveler to spend the night there. The bench was comfortable enough, but at first he couldn't fall asleep because of mice running around in the walls and under the floorboards. Scratching, squeaking. He'd hiss at them and they'd go quiet for a moment, then start again. Eventually, exhaustion from the long river trip took over, and Sasha fell asleep. He woke up suddenly sometime after midnight. At first, he didn't understand why. The mice were quiet. The house was completely silent. But something had clearly woken him. Then he realized what it was. Inside the house, there was a sound that absolutely shouldn't have been there. The sound of a ticking clock. Tick, tock, tick, tock. Sasha lay there listening. Maybe he imagined it? No, it was unmistakable. Tick, tock. When he went to sleep, there had been no clock in the room. In fact, there were almost no objects at all. Just benches, a table, and a couple of empty dressers leaning crookedly against the wall. But the ticking continued. Sasha got up, grabbed his flashlight, and searched the room. He checked every corner, opened every drawer, even stepped outside into the entryway. Nothing. And outside, the ticking couldn't be heard. After half an hour of searching, he finally gave up and went back to the bench, pulling the hood of his jacket over his head. Luckily, the ticking eventually stopped, and he fell asleep again. The next morning, he decided to explore the surrounding forest with his rifle. The place looked so untouched that he was almost certain there would be plenty of game. He wasn't wrong. By the end of the day, he had shot 2 enormous capercaillies and several fat partridges. At one point, he even had to return to the boat just to drop off the birds, so he wouldn't have to carry them through the dense forest. The only thing that spoiled the day was the rain. By afternoon, it started pouring and didn't stop. Sasha was completely soaked. Instead of continuing down the river as planned, he returned to the old house to dry off and wait out the storm. The roof still held. The room stayed dry. After some effort, he even managed to light the long abandoned stone stove. Soon, the room was warm. He dried his clothes, cooked fresh meat over the fire, and lit the candle on the table. The fire crackled softly. The candle burned quietly. For a moment, it almost felt cozy, like a 5-star hotel. Well, a forest version of one. After warming up and eating, Sasha lay down on the bench and quickly fell asleep. He woke up from a nightmare. In the dream, he was sitting in the same room. In the corner of the floor, there was a hole, and he somehow knew that something evil was inside it, something pulling him toward it. Curiosity forced him closer. He stepped toward the hole, leaning over to look inside, and suddenly he was dragged downward like into a whirlpool. That was when he woke up in terror. Just a dream. But then he heard it again. Tick, tock. The clock. The same invisible ticking as the night before. The stove had almost gone out and the room was growing cold. The window glass had been broken long ago. Sasha added some broken fence boards to the fire, turned on his flashlight, and began searching again. Almost unconsciously, he glanced toward the corner where the hole had appeared in his dream. A dresser stood there. He pushed the heavy thing aside. Under it was a cellar hatch, and the ticking was coming from underneath it. Inside the cellar, he found an old Soviet alarm clock, a Yantar, rusty, paint peeling, the glass missing from the face, but it was ticking loudly. When Sasha picked it up, it immediately stopped. He shook it. It ticked for a moment, then stopped again. Then he realized the spring wasn't wound. After several turns of the winding key, the clock suddenly came to life again, ticking loudly. He set it on the table, then opened the inner hatch of the cellar. The smell that came from below nearly made him choke. When he shined the flashlight inside, he froze. The cellar was half filled with water, and sticking out of the water was a human hand, rotting. Sasha didn't think twice. He grabbed his things, took the alarm clock almost automatically, ran to the boat, and left immediately. He didn't want to wait for morning with something like that beneath the floor. When he reached his village the next day, he went straight to the police. A few days later, they recovered the body. It belonged to a woman. The investigation revealed something horrifying. She had been a prison guard from a nearby correctional colony. Years earlier, 2 prisoners had escaped and taken her hostage. Eventually, they hid in that abandoned village. The woman had broken her leg and couldn't walk anymore. According to the captured escapee's confession, she kept begging them to surrender. They finally snapped. They beat her badly, broke her arms and the other leg, and threw her into the cellar. Then they bolted the hatch shut. And, as a cruel joke, they wound up the alarm clock they found in the house. Placing it on top of the hatch, they shouted, "When the clock stops ticking, you die." And that would have been the end of the story, if not for that old Yantar alarm clock. Lena later managed to get it from Sasha and gave it to me. It worked perfectly. One full wind lasted almost 2 days. But the strange thing was this. Whenever someone in the house got sick, the clock would start slowing down. Sometimes it would stop completely. But when everything was fine, it ticked loudly, steady, like a heartbeat. Actually, something even stranger happened later. Around the same time I brought that clock into my apartment, knocking noises started coming from inside the wall of a closet niche. The clock stood there for years, ticking. The knocking continued the whole time. Until May this year, when I sold the clock to a collector. The knocking stopped the same day. Only recently did I connect those 2 events, but honestly, it was probably just a coincidence. This happened in the early 2000s. I ran into one of the strangest phenomena of my life thanks to an old acquaintance of mine named Sergey. Though he was already somewhere around 35 or 40, nobody ever called him anything but Seryoga. I had known Seryoga for years, back when he worked as a diesel locomotive engineer at an industrial rail station in Nizhny Tagil. Because of my job, I dealt with railroad workers pretty often, and that's where we met. Over the course of a few years, I watched him completely fall apart. He was first demoted from engineer for drinking. Then he got pushed down to being an assistant, assembling rail cars in the yard. Eventually, they kicked him out of that job too, despite his experience and the fact that the bosses used to respect him. The man simply drank himself into the ground. Honestly, after that demotion, I don't think I ever saw him sober again. Because of vodka, Seryoga lost everything. Would still show up at my place with some sad little problem, and I couldn't quite turn him away. I remembered what kind of decent guy he used to be, so sometimes I'd lend him a little money for cigarettes, sometimes give him some food, sometimes just pour him a shot so he could steady himself. Open the door. And at first, I don't even open the door. And at first, I don't even recognize the man standing there. He looked like a homeless drifter. Hair down to his shoulders, a huge beard, missing teeth, ragged clothes. And he smelled like the forest. I almost didn't let him inside. But then he hods out half a bucket of fresh blueberries. Well, you can't just slam the door on a guy holding blueberries. He tells me he's been living up north in the region, in his own place, for almost 2 summers now. Says the area is incredible. No people around, mushrooms everywhere. Blueberries, lingonberries, cranberries. For a hunter, he says, it's paradise. And the bastard knew exactly how to hook me. Come visit, he said. You won't regret it. I've even got a hunting dog. Long story short, he got me curious. By the end of August, my hunting partner and I decided to go see this place. First, we drove about 600 kilometers to a small settlement. From there, we caught a diesel locomotive with a crew Seryoga knew. Somehow he'd made friends with railroad guys even there. That was the only way to reach his house, either by locomotive or helicopter. And the house he had bragged about, it turned out to be an abandoned shack at an abandoned sawmill near the tracks, deep in the taiga. The building was black with age, leaning sideways like it was about to collapse. That's where he lived. No electricity, no plumbing, no civilization. He said 2 other drunks had lived in a neighboring shack before, but one day they went into the forest and never came back. After that, he stayed there alone. Strangely enough, he didn't seem bothered by that life at all. In summer and fall, he gathered mushrooms, berries, and pine nuts, then sold them to locomotive crews passing by. When winter came, he'd head back to the city. So he met us in the settlement like we agreed, and personally escorted us to his place on the locomotive. When we finally sat down at a makeshift plank table to have a drink after the trip, I noticed something. There was a tick buried in Seryoga's neck. A huge one. I pointed it out. He just shrugged. I pull 5 of these off myself every day, he said. Sometimes more. Now quit staring and pour the antidote. The man was basically suicidal. The first day we just settled in and rested. Next morning we went out to see his hunting grounds, and he hadn't lied about the dog. There really was a dog named Pupsik, but he looked just as wild as his owner. Honestly, he didn't seem to consider Seryoga his master at all, and he completely ignored us. The dog had a massive head, almost like a wolf's, with fangs as thick as a finger, and he was about the size of a Caucasian shepherd. Seryoga even said he'd seen Pupsik running with she-wolves before. And Seryoga, for all his faults, was never known to lie. That morning we went deep into the forest. To my surprise, Seryoga even had a rifle. Mushrooms were everywhere. You could harvest them right from the doorstep. But we were there for game. Around noon, we reached an abandoned logging clearing. There was a strange sight there. Between two pine trees stood an old, rotting table with benches. But the wooden rain canopy above it was as high as a 4-story building. Over the years, the trees had grown and lifted the whole structure up into the air. Then Seryoga showed us something I had never seen in all my years wandering through forests. Right in the middle of the woods was a perfectly square depression in the ground. The surface was completely flat, covered in bright green grass about 2 inches tall. It looked like a carpet. The square was maybe 6 meters by 6 meters. No footprints. No signs of human activity, and we were deep in the wilderness. You almost felt compelled to step onto it. Seryoga walked straight into the middle and waved us over. When I stepped on it, the ground felt like thick jelly under my boots. It wobbled when you pressed down, but it didn't collapse. We stood there a moment, and then Seryoga said, "Want to see something weird?" "Go ahead." He grabbed a long, sturdy stick and hurled it down like a spear into the ground. It sank halfway in. "Now try pulling it out." I grabbed it and pulled upward, but instead of coming out, the stick started sliding deeper down, hard. It felt like something underground was sucking it in with enormous force. I couldn't hold it even with both hands. We tried several more sticks. Same result. The ground swallowed them. They snapped, but nothing came back up. It didn't even look like a swamp. The ground around us was dry, and we were standing on the surface without sinking. A complete mystery. We eventually shrugged it off and kept walking. Seryoga told us he knew several places like that. But here's the strangest part. They moved, slowly but noticeably. That square we had just stepped on, he said, had been about 30 meters away the previous summer. While we were walking, Pupsik chased down a few hares and ate them himself. When I asked what kind of hunting dog eats the game instead of driving it toward the hunter, Seryoga just laughed. "Until Pupsik fills his belly," he said, "we're not getting any." Not long after that, we flushed a small group of roe deer. We heard the dog driving them toward us. Then suddenly, one of the deer let out a terrible scream. Pupsik was barking, but he wasn't attacking it. We ran through the fallen trees toward the noise. On a small clearing, we saw the same kind of green square, and in the middle of it, a roe deer was trapped. Its front legs had punched through the surface during a jump, just like our sticks had earlier. Now something below was slowly pulling it down. The dog stood at the edge, barking wildly, but refusing to get closer. We stayed back too. From solid ground, we watched as the animal was slowly dragged downward. The back legs stayed above the surface, but the front of the body kept sinking. The sight was horrifying. Legs slid down like 2 sticks. Within legs slid down like 2 sticks. Within seconds, the grass smoothed itself back out. It was as if nothing had ever happened. We stood there, stunned. Even Seryoga had never seen anything like it before. And we had been walking on one of those things earlier. We carefully stepped onto this one too. Same thing. It held our weight. The complete puzzle. After 2 days of hunting, we returned to the city. Generous as ever, Seryoga even gave us 2 large pairs of moose antlers he had found in the forest. He said he'd discovered several over the years, but only managed to carry these 2 out. At the end of September, I visited him once more. That's when he told me something disturbing. He had recently found 2 woven baskets near one of those green squares. Both were filled with half-rotted mushrooms. The baskets were carefully placed beside a tree, like someone had just set them down for a moment. But there were no other signs of people. Later, he heard in the village that search teams had been looking for a married couple who went missing while mushroom picking. He never told anyone about the baskets. He was afraid suspicion might fall on him. But after a few drinks, he told me, and I could tell he wasn't lying. Then, in October, Seryoga himself disappeared. He promised he'd bring me cranberries when he came to the city for the winter, but he never showed up. I called his railroad friends in the settlement. They said nobody had seen him in a long time. They stopped by his shack along the tracks. His belongings were still there, but his berry-picking baskets were gone. And so was Pupsik. It's been almost 15 years now. No one has ever heard from Seryoga again. Most likely something happened to him in the forest while he was out gathering cranberries. But getting lost, that would have been impossible. I never returned to those places again. And in all my years, I have never seen those strange green jelly-like squares anywhere else. None of the hunters or travelers I know have ever heard of anything like it either. So maybe someone here knows what that was. Over the past month, I'd gone mushroom picking several times. And during one of those trips, I had a strange story. About 5 years ago, Semyon, the man telling the story, once again travelled far north to fish for pike and taimen. He had good friends in one of the remote northern villages, and he usually stayed with them for about a week. That's where he would salt the fish he caught. Fishing was the main reason for the trip, but he always brought his rifle along too. This time was no different. Before focusing on fishing, he decided to dedicate the first day to hunting. Unfortunately, the friend who usually guided him through the local hunting grounds had fallen ill and couldn't come along. Instead, he sent his hunting dog, a tough little Laika. Early in the morning, Semyon and the dog headed into the forest. They walked in the direction his friend had pointed out, toward his hunting grounds, careful not to cross into anyone else's territory. Out there, every hunter had his own patch of forest. The hunt began about 10 kilometers away from the village. There were birds everywhere, partridges, hazel grouse, black grouse, plenty of hares too. By noon, Semyon had shot so much game he could barely carry it. The animals practically threw themselves under his feet. How could a hunter resist that instinct? He kept firing left and right. Eventually, he decided to take a break, rest, and have a bite to eat. After lunch, the warm sunlight made him sleepy. He only meant to lie down for a moment, but the fatigue caught up with him, and he passed out for an hour or more. He woke up when raindrops began tapping his face. When he opened his eyes, the sky was covered in black clouds. The forest had darkened. The birds had gone silent. And on top of that, the dog had disappeared. He called and whistled, but there was no answer. With nothing else to do, he decided to find shelter from the rain and then start heading back. He crawled under the wide branches of a large spruce tree, dragging his heavy backpack and rifle with him, and waited for the weather to pass. But the rain only got worse. Evening was approaching, and spending the night in a wet forest didn't sound appealing. It seemed he'd have to head back through the rain after all. Just as he was thinking this over, a young roe deer suddenly ran out onto a clearing about 10 meters from the tree where he was hiding. It stood there nervously twitching its ears, unaware of the danger. Semyon couldn't resist. The hunting instinct took over. He slowly raised the rifle and fired. From that distance, even a blind man couldn't have missed. Only then did the problem occur to him. How was he supposed to carry the deer along with everything else, soaking wet under the rain? And the compass needle spun wildly as if possessed, probably because of iron deposits in the ground. So he just started walking. After 3 hours of trudging through the forest with the unbearable load, climbing over fallen trees and rough terrain, he was completely exhausted. The clouds had thickened, the rain had intensified, and dusk was already falling. It was September. Night came quickly. There was no choice now. He would have to spend the night in the forest. He shoved the backpack with his trophies, the stiffening roe deer, and the rifle under a dense spruce tree, and began trying to start a fire. In the damp forest, it was difficult. Dry wood was nearly impossible to find in the rain. Eventually, he managed to get a small fire going. Too small to dry himself, too small to cook anything. Soon the forest was swallowed by complete darkness. Around midnight, the brushwood he had gathered earlier ran out. Semyon didn't want to sit there in the cold dampness until morning, so he grabbed his flashlight and headed deeper into the forest to find more wood. He shone the beam through the bushes. Nothing. The forest was young and clean, without old fallen logs. He gathered a few thin branches and was about to head back, when suddenly his entire body jolted, like he'd been hit with electricity. The flashlight beam had caught something in the darkness, a moss-covered fallen tree, and sitting on it was an old woman. She wore a headscarf, a green button sweater, and a backpack. At her feet stood a large basket completely full of mushrooms. She sat sideways to Semyon, staring silently into the forest. For several seconds, the stunned hunter couldn't say a word. Finally, he swallowed the lump in his throat and croaked, "Grandma, how did you get out here?" The old woman slowly turned her head toward him and stared. She didn't say a single word. She was only about 6 meters away, yet Semyon couldn't see her eyes clearly. They seemed either too deeply set or too dark. They stared at each other for about a minute. Then the old woman slowly raised her hand and pointed with her finger. Opened his mouth again. "Grandma," come to opened his mouth again. "Grandma, come to my fire." But at that very moment, the flashlight suddenly went out. Everything plunged into complete darkness. No sound came from the woman. Semyon spun around and hurried back toward his camp, almost running. The fire was barely glowing. The wet branches he threw on it killed the last sparks. The fire died. Terrified by the encounter with the strange midnight mushroom picker, Semyon crawled under the spruce tree, pressed himself against his stuffed backpack, gripped the rifle, and sat silently, listening to every sound. All night he felt as if the sinister old woman was creeping closer, waiting for the right moment to attack. He only managed to doze off a couple of times, and even in his uneasy half-sleep, he saw the silent old woman again. This time, she spoke. "Go where I pointed, and leave the burden. Don't be greedy." When morning finally came, Semyon crawled out of his shelter and, remembering the words from the dream, dumped half of his hunting trophies out of the backpack. He didn't dare take the stiff roe deer either. With the rifle ready, he cautiously approached the fallen tree where the flashlight had revealed the mysterious traveler. No one was there. He walked around the place several times, carefully examining the tree and the grass. There were no tracks. Nothing. Not a single sign that a person had been sitting there just a few hours earlier. Even the grass wasn't bent. Maybe it had all been a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and fear. Semyon tried to remember the direction the old woman had pointed. He was about to leave when something unusual caught his eye. Something stuck in the bark of the fallen tree. He pried it loose with the tip of his knife. It was an old green mother-of-pearl button. So the old woman hadn't been a dream after all. He slipped the button into his pocket and continued walking in the direction she had pointed. He ignored the hares jumping from under his feet and the birds flying up from the bushes. He walked straight ahead. Hours later, the clouds began to clear, and the forest grew brighter. Soon, he heard distant gunshots from the direction he was heading. An hour later, he was already telling his story to the men from the village who had gone out searching for him. They had become worried when the dog returned alone the previous evening. The first thing he told them about was the old woman with the mushrooms. The men stared at him in confusion. There were no old women in their village brave enough to wander the forest at night with a full basket of mushrooms. And there were no other settlements for 100 miles. Later that evening, after a few shots of vodka, one of the older men remembered something. About 30 or 35 years earlier, an old woman had disappeared in those woods. She lived alone on the edge of the village, so no one noticed right away. They began searching for her only several days later. They eventually found her about a week afterward. A hunter had stumbled upon her by accident. She was sitting on a fallen tree, a basket of mushrooms at her feet, a backpack full of them on her back. The hunter called out to her. No answer. When he came closer, he realized she had been dead for quite some time. She hadn't fallen because the backpack supported her body, so she remained sitting there for days. Maybe her heart had failed, or maybe the burden had simply been too heavy. "We buried her at the small cemetery outside the village," one of the men said. "Tomorrow, go take a look at the grave. There's a photo there." The next morning, before going fishing, Semyon went to the cemetery. There were barely 20 graves, so it didn't take long to find. From a black and white oval photo on one of the rusted iron crosses looked a familiar face. It wasn't nearly as frightening as it had seemed in the forest. Her eyes were light, not dark like that night. She wore a white headscarf and an old-fashioned buttoned sweater. The inscription read, "Agrippina Semyonovna Larioshkina." Semyon reached into his pocket and pulled out the green pearl button. "Thank you, Agrippina Semyonovna. Who knows what would have happened to me if it weren't for you? And I'll remember your words. I won't waste animals for nothing anymore." He buried the green button under the cross and returned to the village. From that day on, when fishing, he only kept large pike, no smaller than 8 or 9 pounds. Everything smaller he released back into the water